Nerdrotic.com.
Greetings, you over 1 million hellions and the 40% who haven't subscribed yet. In the immortal words of every woman who's ever lived, it's not how you start, it's how you finish. Thus is the story of Alien Romulus, or Alien 1.5, the, ironically enough, mid-middle movie, and a year overloaded with prequels and sequels filled with cameos, key jangling, member berries, repurposed dialogue, repurposed scenes, repurposed characters, and derivative stories. There is Alien Romulus, which can be both a prequel and a sequel, which is distributed by Disney, who at their recent D23 conference announced more prequels and sequels. That most likely will be filled with cameos, key jangling, and member berries, repurposed dialogue, repurposed scenes, repurposed characters, and derivative storytelling. To be fair, Alien Romulus is not a prequel or a sequel. It's, and I quote, an interquel, a subcategory of midquel, taking place between the events of Alien and Aliens. That just so happens to be filled with a cameo, key jangling, member berries, repurposed dialogue, repurposed scenes, and derivative characters. This time, the xenomorphs are up against Gen Z in space. When I heard that, I was sold until I watched the film. It started out okay and then was completely destroyed by a bad ending.
Impact event in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Alien Ramalama Ding Dong opens up with the ship running across the xenomorph from the first of the only 2 Alien films in deep space. What? Oh yeah, right next to the wreckage of the Nostromo, which was blown up in the first of the only 2 Alien films. What the fuck? The story centers around Rain Carradine, who we will call for the rest of this video Rip-Offly, who is an orphan on the planet Jackson Star and an employee of Weyland-Yutani, who screw her over and give her extra work hours after she was due to leave. After this, coincidentally enough, Rip-Offly and her synthetic brother Andy, who's in dire need of an update, are contacted by some of their fellow Gen Zers who hatched a plan to escape to another system with better living conditions. As far as the accurate depiction of Gen Z goes, you completely had me when they all want to quit their jobs, but the suspension of disbelief falls apart when the film says they actually worked.
Got him!
Anywho, the plan is to steal a ship and then go after some cryo chambers on a nearby decommissioned space station for the 9-year trip. But it turns out poor Andy the synth was only brought along because he can speak mother. And then he's gonna get left behind because they don't allow synths on the planet they're heading to. Our plucky Gen Zers managed to steal a spaceship and make it to the decommissioned base that's split into 2 parts, Remus and Romulus. After rebooting the system, which brought back online the gravity and, more importantly, the atmosphere, they find the cryo chambers pretty quickly, but there's one problem. They don't have enough cryo fuel, so now they have to go across the station to find some more, and that's where the problems begin. After being attacked by facehuggers after the system reboot, our plucky Gen Zers separate. Another lost opportunity to reach the modern audience. You didn't have one of these Gen Zers posting this attack on their version of TikTok or the Weyland-Yutani Slack. After losing their diverse Gen Z pilot when she gives birth to a xenomorph, something you surprisingly don't see a lot in this film, it's a race to survive while trying to avoid the facehuggers, and the xenomorphs find the cryo fuel and do all this before the space station falls into the rings of Jackson Star. And it turns out this space station wasn't decommissioned at all. Everyone on board was killed. How did we find this out? In the now grand Hollywood tradition of, at the very least, questionable cameos of characters played by dead actors, including but not limited to Peter Cushing's Tarkin, Carrie Fisher's Leia, and Harold Ramis's Egon. We have the return and, in my opinion, the desecration of the late, great Ian Holm, may he rest in peace. Or in this case, we'll call him Team America's Ian Holm, playing Brooke, totally not Ash, in a movie that admittedly had pretty good effects, including some pretty good practical effects. This was embarrassing, forced, and unnecessary. I know you're playing with the time, but Lance Henriksen is still alive. And some might suggest bringing back Michael Fassbender, which would make more sense. Unfortunately, it wouldn't, because there's only 2 Alien films. And what makes it worse is he's in a lot of the film, providing a series of info dumps. While there are a lot of references to the two Alien films, there's also references to other films, which doesn't make very much sense to me because there's only two Alien films. One of them, unfortunately, was Prometheus, and don't worry, there's one that's worse. Weyland-Yutani apparently was experimenting with fusing aspects of a xenomorph with a human to create the perfect human, which in truth is the perfect worker who can survive hostile environments. Far be it from me to point out that you already have that with the androids.
I prefer the term artificial person myself.
I prefer the term artificial person myself.
And after rebooting Andy, Matt Damon Ian Holm gives him a new primary function, which used to be protecting Repurposed, and now it's protecting the company. Now the only way to escape is to go back to Jackson's Star with the samples, because that's the only way Mother will let them back on the ship. Overall, the first 3/4 of Alien Romulus are fine, very average, despite that cringe Matt Damon Ian Holm. The directing from Fede Alvarez was solid, so was the editing. The acting was fine. Most of the CG was pretty good, particularly the space station descending into the rings. Again, surprisingly, there was more face huggers than xenomorphs, but I didn't have a problem with that. Some will say this is a return to Alien's horror roots. I will say this is a return to what we've gotten since the release of the last Alien movie, Aliens. Up into a certain point, and we'll get to that. Aesthetically, they nailed it. The production design, the art direction, the xenomorphs, the costumes, the props, the technology all stayed in line with the only two Alien films. Our plucky group of Gen Zers weren't terrible in this film. They were very serviceable victims to the xenomorph who I was rooting for by the end, with the exception of the one standout for me, Andy the synth. Not simp, synth. I like what they did when they essentially made him the special needs little brother, and then after the reboot turned him into the possible adversary and back. It definitely made him the most fleshed out human character in this. But then there's all the repurposed scenes and repurposed dialogue, including but not limited to,
You have my sympathies.
But you have my sympathies.
Get away from her, you bitch!
Get away from her, you bitch.
and if Alien Romulus ended at roughly the 1 hour and 34 minute mark, things would have been fine. Unfortunately, it didn't. This brings us to the final act, where they went full Prometheus, resurrection, and retard. One of our plucky Gen Zers was pregnant. Now, she was caught by a xenomorph and put into a cocoon, but she wasn't a host. She's freed by Repurposed and her brother, but grievously wounded. So, when she's sent back to the ship to go straight to a cryo chamber to recover from her wounds, instead she shoots herself up with xenomorph juice. To make a long story short, she gives birth to a half-human, half-xenomorph baby, which grows into a full adult within a couple of minutes that looks more like Tweaker Alien, who eventually eats her. Now, there were a lot of people in the theater enjoying this and probably being annoyed at my laughing. And wouldn't you know, they killed Tweaker Alien by tossing him out an airlock and then repurposing a line of dialogue from one of the only two Alien films. And the third act took what was at best a blandly competent film and drove it right off a cliff. Keeping in mind that was worse than the good part of Alien Romulus Ding Dong, when they were rolling with the concept that
Somehow the xenomorph returned.
what? From the first of the only two Alien films, floating in the void of deep space near pieces of the Nostromo that weren't atomized by a nuclear explosion. And yes, they really wanted you to know it was that xenomorph.
I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
This is where there might be some unintentional meta commentary, because this movie extracts the goo from the only two Alien films and mutates and dilutes the rest of the franchise, leaving the door open for more interquels like Alien 1.25 or Alien 1.75. One of the best descriptions I've heard comes from our good friend Robert Meyer Burnett. Remember, authenticity is the currency of the future. When he said, and I'll paraphrase, Alien as a franchise is that band that you love that's decades past its prime, allowing a bunch of mid-level bands to do a poorly produced tribute album of their greatest hits. And yes, the same could be said for all of Hollywood right now. So you can get the aesthetics right all day long, but without any meaning to your story or characters, it's just another piece of soulless content. And on that, at the very least, questionable return of characters played by dead actors. Remember that strike from last year when the Film Actors Guild said the AI boogeyman was going to take all their jobs, when in truth it was about the control of AI, and now all the adult pretenders are rushing out to sign off their likenesses. And it won't be long until we get a movie with new music by Prince and David Bowie, directed by Stanley Kubrick, starring John Wayne, Humphrey Bogart, Clark Gable, John Belushi, Robin Williams, and Marilyn Monroe fighting xenomorphs. To be honest, I'd watch the hell out of that. Ultimately, Alien Romulus is a forgettable drop in the ocean of creative bankruptcy. Now, please repeat after me. There is only one Blade Runner film, To be fair with multiple cuts, there is only one Matrix film, there are only 2 Predator films, there are only 3 Indiana Jones films, and there are only 2 Alien films.
Nerdrotic.com.
If you like what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't like what you heard, I thank you for listening this long. I will see you in the next video.